right, all. Well, you are seeing, for those that are joining, that have joined some of our past tastings before. Well, first of all, welcome to everybody. But for those that have joined past 2020 tastings, you are seeing a new host today. You are not getting Mr. Silas Morgan. You'll get Mr. Silas Morgan towards the back end and throughout. But my name is Gerard Meshka, for those that aren't familiar, and it is a pleasure to welcome everybody to what I think is one of our tastings that's been quite a while in the making. We're really, really excited about this one. It's our first Zoom event of 2021. And again, for those that have taken part in the past ones, thanks for joining again. But there are quite a few new faces, virtual faces, and we certainly appreciate everybody taking part because we're really, really excited. And a little bit about the genesis about this event. So based on requests from everybody, I mean, our past tasting, when we were asking for suggestions or people were thinking about ideas for tastings, I mean, Napa is a very, very logical one to roll into, but we wanted to do something a little bit different. We wanted to try to find a way to source some more highly allocated wines, wines that had some true distinction. Wines that represented a cross section of Napa Valley. There's a lot of different ways to slice it, and being the one who kind of led the charge here, it was, I wouldn't say it was a challenge because this is right in my wheelhouse, but there were so many different ideas and so many different ways to slice it because, I think for those that aren't entirely super familiar with Napa on an intimate level, they see Napa Valley and they kind of think all the styles to be the same. They think the region to be relatively homogenous, and they don't. And we'll kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into it. But there's so many different styles, both old school, new school, modern. You get totally different expressions based on where you're at within the valley, south to north and east to west, and up in the mountains and on the floor. So we wanted to put together something that would just be well beyond just kind of a paint by numbers tasting. And we wanted to grab some wines that aren't easily available to most people, and we think we've done that with all 6 wines, and we're stoked. I think especially with the first flight that we're going to be getting into here in a second, the 2009 Heights Martha's Vineyard and the 2009 Maibach Materium. These are exciting wines for a lot of reasons, but to me they are wines that express Napa Valley at its best. And there's so many different ways you can slice it, and you can obviously enjoy young wines, you can enjoy medium-term wines, and plenty of us enjoy older, truly, very, very mature wines. But to me, the sweet spot of Napa Valley is, at least to me, again, totally my opinion, but 8 to 10 to 12 years out. So it's really, really exciting to have 2 fantastic wines of this pedigree, 2 entirely different wines, but to have them 11 years removed from the vintage is really, really exciting. So in the grand scheme of things, Napa Valley is a relatively young appellation. It's still in its infancy, and it's something that sometimes domestically we sort of take for granted. Compared to, even though Napa Valley has George Yunt was the first to plant grapes in Napa Valley in 1939. Hamilton Walker introduced vinifera grapes. 1839. George Yunt planted grapes in 1839, and then Hamilton Walker Craft introduced the vinifera grapes, or wine growing grapes. So, in the grand scheme of things, less than 200 years of grape growing, which pales certainly in comparison to all your producers on the other side of the world. But we've come along. We collectively, just kind of as a domestic, winemaking country, we've certainly come a long way in that time. And so Charles Krug was the first commercial winery in 1861, and followed by Schramsberg and Beringer and Inglenook. So names that we know and we've all heard, but many of us, especially who are the younger generation who's getting just kind of getting into wine, they see and hear those names, but they don't understand the relevance and the importance of those names. Your Charles Krugs, your Schramsbergs, your Beringers, your Inglenooks. They were the ones who laid the foundation for the modern wines that we're enjoying today. Unfortunately, phylloxera and prohibition, phylloxera just devastating the vineyards on a ground level, and then certainly prohibition in the early portion of the 20th century dealt a huge blow to what was an industry that was, certainly on a great trajectory. So it kind of set everything back, and it caused abandoned vineyards and abandoned wineries, and it took decades of progress and kind of brought it to a halt. So essentially, it was a reset. Now we're kind of starting from scratch, and that's when we talk about our modern iteration of Napa Valley. And we'll get into there. Napa Valley slowly recovered. Then that's this new iteration of Napa Valley is, Martini, Beaulieu, the Mondavi family comes in. They buy the Charles Krug vineyard or the Charles Krug winery, and the Mondavi lays down family roots. But I think and it's been dramatized for sure, but there is something to be said. There was great wines being made in the 60s and 70s, but until that Paris tasting of 76 put Napa on the map, that's kind of what it took to legitimize Napa on the world stage. So that was when Chateau Montelena Chardonnay and the Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cabernet in the blind tasting against equally pedigreed, frankly more pedigreed, not even equally pedigreed, at least, wines with great history from Bordeaux and Burgundy. Those two wines from the U.S. Bested those in the blind tasting, and that really, really kind of legitimized Napa Valley on the world stage. And it also caused, it raised the level of quality across Napa Valley. So Napa Valley received its AVA in 1981, AVA being an American viticultural area. And it is, believe it or not, the second one in the U.S. Interesting piece of trivia. The first one in the U.S., Augusta, Missouri. So, so interesting there. Obviously everybody assumes that Napa Valley, for good reason, was the first. They were the first in California to receive their AVA designation, and so what that is, it basically says that such and such region has specific geographic or climatic features that distinguish it from the surrounding areas. So, certainly you can grow grapes anywhere, but obviously there are reasons that grapes thrive in certain regions. And for you to put Napa Valley on your label, now you can. I mean, in the past it wasn't always that way in terms of just there are regulations that go along with everything that includes the grape growing today. So we'll definitely transition into the wines here in a second. But the one thing that makes the Napa Valley is so unique, and this is certainly appeals to my colleague Silas, it should to all of us, but it's so interesting that Napa Valley, despite, and in the intro that we sent out for this invite, or for the invitation, the lead into the tasting, Napa Valley in the grand scheme of things, 30 miles north to south, about 5 miles at its longest points east to west. So in the grand scheme of things, not a particularly big region, but it has 100 different soil variations, 33 different soil series, and half the world's soil orders. So that's where, when we start talking about what makes all of these wines different, and how Napa Valley is just not a homogeneous area where everything is the same. I mean, you can literally have, much like in there's a reason that certainly vineyards that ostensibly in Bordeaux and Burgundy, same thing with Napa Valley, ostensibly side by side with one another, you would think you would be getting the exact same types of wines. Not necessarily, and that's both. There's obviously the human element involved that comes to the winemaking and everything that goes there, but there's certainly the geology that plays a significant role there. So Napa Valley, Silas, if you could throw up the just kind of the basic Napa Valley AVA map to give us a little bit of orientation here, and see if we can pull that up. But Napa Valley is not divided, but the valley to the west has the Mayacamas mountain range, and to the east it has the Vaca mountain ranges, and that is huge. And you can good. So you can see the Vaca and the Mayacamas, and what that does, that narrow valley, again from the Mayacamas to the Vaca, about 5-ish miles. And again, as you can kind of see, I mean, that's not a true north to south Napa Valley. It's more of a northwest to southeast orientation. But the Vaca Mountains on the east side protect Napa Valley from the extreme heat inland, whereas on the west side, the Mayacamas range protects you from the much cooler other side of the Mayacamas, which is actually Sonoma. So you're getting, you're getting a really contained environment. Now you do have quite a bit of variance from south to north, and as you can see there at the bottom, Silas has Carneros right there. I mean, Carneros. Nobody thinks of Carneros as a Cabernet growing area. It's not to say that there's not, but Cabernet doesn't ripen particularly well. That's very southernly there in Napa Valley, and it's if you were, and it's not, it's Silas. Don't worry about it. It doesn't have the San Pablo Bay on the the most extreme south end. But if this map were to continue going south, you would have you would have a maritime influence, and that's where you start to see everything that kind of brings the fog in and creates these unique microclimates within Napa Valley. So Carneros, primarily cooler climate grapes, not surprisingly Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, a little bit of Merlot, because Merlot ripens a little bit better, or a little bit, it's Napa or Cabernet, certainly takes a longer time to ripen. Coombsville, as you can kind of see there, just the northeast of Napa Valley. Very, it's a burgeoning AVA. It just got its AVA designation in the grand scheme of things not all that long ago, but produces Cabernet that's much different than the Cabernet that we'll get into here. And then as you get here, being a lot of these wines come from Oakville, which is kind of the tenderloin of the valley there. But as you start working your way north, naturally you're going to get a lot warmer, and the grapes ripen a lot quicker, and your wines get a lot richer and more opulent. So as you get more towards the south, you're going to get slightly more austere wines. As you get up more into Yountville, as you can see there, working our way northwest, Yountville, Oakville, Rutherford, St. Helena, certainly into Calistoga, you're getting into 90, 95, sometimes 100-degree days, when you can have 82 or 85-degree days more towards the south. So a significant shift there. And I think in a nutshell, that kind of gives everybody, we could obviously do super deep dives on all this, but it's important sometimes to just kind of see it on a map, understand that even though we can't greatly picture the mountains there, the Mayacamas and the Vacas do create that Napa Valley there, that works northwest to southeast, and so many different styles of wines that we'll certainly get into here. So let's get into the wines, and this is exciting because it's funny. We were talking about ways to present these flights, and we're going to start off with some of the big boys. Sometimes people like to enjoy the more mature wines, and again, these are crazy mature, but they are 11 years old relative to the other ones. They're far more developed than the other wines. But we thought it would be nice to start with the 2009 Heights Martha's Vineyard and the 2009 Maibach Materium. So I'll certainly talk our way through the wines, but let's enjoy the aromas of Martha's, and let's enjoy a couple sips of the wine first. And to me, while a lot of hardcore Napa Valley drinkers that are familiar with Martha's know it for the predominant eucalyptus nose, it's there. It's not quite as prominent as some of the other Martha's that that I've had in the not too far off past, but it's a little bit more subdued. That said, it smells like classic Cabernet. It has, frankly, to me, it actually has a slightly Bordeaux-ish nose. I'm not calling it a Bordeaux wine by any stretch, but it does have some elements that certainly remind me of something from the left bank. And if nothing else, it's a wine that you can tell two things. Number one, it's got a little bit of age on it, and then number two, not surprisingly, Heights has never been driven by ripeness and higher alcohols. So the wine is far more subdued. I mean, to appreciate Martha's, and we will here. It's a pretty wine. It's a pretty wine, and I think it's developed sort of a reputation of being just a little bit more of a thinking man and thinking woman's wine. It's not going to punch you in the face. It's not going to be high octane. I mean, Martha's very rarely gets too far above 14% alcohol. And to me, the Heights story, as we continue to enjoy the wine, the Heights story is to me quintessential, old school hard work and building something from scratch. I mean, Heights was founded in 1961 by Joe and Alice Heights. Prior to founding Heights, Joe studied at UC Davis, was one of their earliest graduates in the School of Enology, and he worked at Beaulieu Vineyard as the right-hand man to famed winemaker Andrei Chelichev. So, that is Napa Valley royalty. Joe learned from the best. He is one of, Joe unfortunately passed in 2000, but he is certainly one of the modern pioneers of Napa Valley. And Martha's Vineyard, the Heights Martha's Vineyard Cabernet, bears a distinction of being the first ever Napa Valley single vineyard wine. And we think, as we have this conversation here in 2021, we take that for granted. Like, my God, there's brands that have 5, 6, 7, 8 different single vineyards in their portfolio. I mean, back 40 years ago, to designate such a vineyard as being worthy of just that distinction. In the past, everything was just labeled, either California or just generally Napa Valley. It could certainly come from a single vineyard, but the idea of designating it as such was a really big deal. The original deal was sealed by a handshake between Tom May and Joe Heights, and Tom May and his wife Martha. Not surprisingly, that's who bears the name of the vineyard. They developed a friendship after the May family moved into their new home and were in Napa Valley, and were gifted 2 bottles of Heights Cabernet. And that was it. That was the start of the relationship that developed between Joe Heights and Tom May. Tom May was a big fan of Heights and had vines on the property. Joe Heights was very interested in the possibility of working with those vines, and after 1 year, felt and 1 year of using what is now the Martha's Vineyard, those vines were blended into the broader Heights Cabernet. Joe Heights said, "Hey, wait a minute, this is as a standalone, this is worthy of bearing like just being number one made as we call it now, of course, a single vineyard wine, but having the Martha's Vineyard designate on the label." And that is, again, something that we take for granted now, but looking back on it, it was pretty revolutionary. Heights has had the same winemaker, until recently, they had the same winemaker, David Heights, Joe Heights' son, for 40 years. So the consistency of Heights, not surprisingly, the wines have always just been, beautiful, elegant, steady wines. And David Heights, Joe Heights' son, is responsible, certainly played a large role in that, working with his father. And up until recently, just made his last vintage. And Heights is unique. And, before we transition into my block, to me, this is probably one of the most important technical, educational aspects of anything that I'll say tonight, because Heights is very unique in their aging process. The fact that they age their wines 1 year in neutral oak casks, 3 years in French oak, and 1 additional year in the bottle. Ostensibly, that doesn't sound like that's anything too crazy, but it is so much out of the norm from Napa Valley that it is almost caught. And first of all, it kind of makes Heights what it is. They don't care. They do things their own way. They are perfectly content to fly a little bit under the radar, despite their pedigree, despite the fact that Martha's Vineyard has been a fantastic wine for so many years. The reality is, when you put that care, that attention to detail into your wines, the reality is we're talking about 5 years of aging. Now, as we have this conversation here in 2021, we think back, the 2015 Heights Martha's is just now, getting released. Antonio Galoni and some of the critics are doing reviews on 2018 and 2019 Napa Valley. So you think, why has Heights, maintained a little bit more of a low profile? Why have they never been driven so much by scores and press and everything like that? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're a little bit out of step with the way that the modern press and the modern trade sort of works. That said, they've never been particularly keen on submitting all their wines for review. And interestingly enough, Joe Heitz and Robert Parker had a little bit of a friendly tiff back in the day. And Robert Parker said some things that weren't so nice about the Heitz wines. And so Joe Heitz didn't necessarily want all of his wines to be reviewed by Parker. And he also felt that, whereas Parker wanted to review a lot of wines from barrel, Joe Heitz said that he felt that wines weren't ready to be evaluated in barrel. And he felt that the true evaluation of a wine, the true critique of a wine, the true enjoyment of a wine should come after, Heitz has gone through their whole process, or any wine has gone through that whole process. So it's a little bit interesting. It's, I think as we, as we pay a lot of attention to scores and the trade and critics and everything like that, we all enjoy it, we all appreciate it. The reality is Heitz has, it has never really cared much about that. And frankly, I think that's okay. And I think that's what kind of makes Heitz Heitz. And I'll bounce it over to you guys, and trust me, everybody. I love talking about Heitz. And if you times this by 6, we'd be here for 5 hours. And don't worry, we won't be. Everything else will be a lot more concise. But I think Heitz is really important to give them their just due. They're one of the classics. I think that they matter. And I can only hope that, despite the fact that a couple years ago the family did sell. We'll see what the future brings. They feel that they've passed the torch to a team and a winemaker who cares about the wine as much as the family has for half a century. But this matters. So I think giving Heitz that just due, and I think the fact that we're leading in with Heitz, despite the fact that it would have been nice to have this wine at the very end. I think it was important to give Heitz their just due. So I'll bounce it over to you guys and let me know what you think of the wine.
Well, I'm going to start off by saying, as I studied soil science and how it related to wine, and Napa Valley is as you said, one of the most exciting areas when it comes to soil variation. I mean, California in general, especially when it comes to the mountains and the volcanism around the San Andreas Fault, it's an incredibly complicated landscape.
Yeah.
And what I'm constantly impressed by Napa is that they've kind of nailed down the parameters of, where particular rootstocks and what, particular clones of Cabernet or other varieties, suit particular soil types. And it's always exciting to kind of taste a wine that really suits the place. And I feel like Heitz Martha's is one of those places where it's such a distinctive wine year in and year out. I mean, we've had, I think back to the Magnum of 1998, a quote unquote, bad, cool year in Napa, and just a beautiful, beautiful wine. And it's those sites that endure for, centuries. You look at Bordeaux, there's these sites, of particular gravels that just sing and will always do better than their neighbor, as you said, a stone's throw away. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of Heitz Martha's. Maybe not as sleek or polished as say even the Maybach next to it, but just a truly distinctive wine.
Yeah. Simon, what do you think?
Oh, I love the wine. I think it's got an elegance and a finesse which I always look for in a great Cabernet. It's drinking beautifully now. I think it'll last for many years to come still. But it's really absolutely, I mean, what a way to start a tasting.
Yeah, right. And kind of getting back, as we kind of transition to the Maybach here. I mean, 2 other quick relevant points about Heitz. Number one, just their commitment to, to quality. They declassified one of the few, frankly, one of the only, 2011 Napa Valley, a little bit unlike Bordeaux in the sense that Napa Valley doesn't quite have as much variance. I mean, the thing that makes Napa Valley is that, especially with modern winemaking, they can withstand some more challenging vintages. Plus the fact that the weather is just a little bit steadier, just the reality of it. So there are truly very few truly inferior or difficult or really hyper challenging vintages. 2011 was one of them. And Heitz said, not only are we going to declassify our Martha's Vineyard, we're not even going to make our trail side, which anybody else who is familiar with Heitz, knows that their trail side is another beautiful wine from Rutherford. They declassified Heights Martha's, they declassified Heights Trailside. They put it all into the Heights Napa Valley Cabernet, and it speaks volumes. I mean, it's just, you know, they care about, you know, that the brand so much that to declassify there. And I'll leave you with this: if you know, Silas, actually, you know, bring up if you could, and it'll be actually a perfect transition to just the Oakville AVA. And if you could zoom it into on the west side there, on the extreme west side, you know, nudging up against the Mayacamas, so we can kind of see exactly where Martha's is at. Yep, if you could maybe just zoom it in a little bit, and in the bottom left of the screen there, we can see Heights Martha's. I mean, look at those neighbors. You know, I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, but, you know, true to Heights style, how many times, you know, you never hear people say, well, we're right next door to Harlan Estate. Probably because Heights is thinking, as good as Harlan is, I mean, let's be honest, Harlan is a great wine. Heights is saying, well, Harlan Estate is right next to Martha's Vineyard, you know? So, I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, you never hear Heights marketing, you know, talk about where they're at. They just want to maintain that low profile. They're fine kind of being tucked away. But you're talking about Bond, Harlan, the Opus One vineyards. I mean, you're, you know, to the south there, you've got Vine Hill Ranch. You know, a little bit to the northeast, you've got the Tokelon Vineyard. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And, you know, that's just exactly how Heights likes it. So while we're here, actually, it's a perfect kind of segue. Silas, if you could just kind of move us over to the east side there, to Eastern Oakville. And we are going to transition into the Maibach Materium, which, and this is interestingly enough, owned by the Turnbull, and not the Turnbull family, but, you know, the owners of Turnbull own the Leopoldina vineyard there that you see, and Turnbull makes a Leopoldina. The vineyard is actually the White's Vineyard, Weitz, and that is where this Maibach Materium comes from. And as you can see, it is just off the Silverado Trail. It's actually, as you know, a lot of this White's Vineyard, again, right where you see Turnbull Leopoldina, it's considerable elevation. You really can't see it there, but it does get up to about 1,000 feet. And the first vintage of the Maibach Materium was 05. It's sourced from a single block. So, you know, you're taking a already good vineyard, you are narrowing it down to what Thomas Rivers Brown and Chris Maibach feel is the best of that block. That's what they've been working with for quite a while. Carter Cellars does work with fruit from the White's / Leopoldina vineyard. Again, Turnbull makes, you know, their own designate there. But without question, that single block, not surprisingly, that Maibach works with, has really become highly sought after, and it is a big time vineyard. And as you can see right there, we're not too far from Della Valle, who we'll transition into in just a little bit. But these, as you start to get up the hillsides here, you're talking about much shallower soils, lots of pebbles, lots of stones, and much different soils than we've got on the floor. And not surprisingly, much different wines. So a little bit quickly about the Maibach family. And, you know, while I'm talking here, let's enjoy the wine. Much different. Nice. You know, it's a good example of Thomas Rivers Brown winemaking, because, and again, for those that aren't familiar, this is, I mean, the Maibach Materium is probably his, you know, second most prestigious / sought after / you know, tightly allocated wine that he particularly makes, after Schrader. So, and some people feel that it rivals Schrader. But needless to say, I mean, this is it's a beautiful wine, but it's not nearly as you know, hyper ripe and you know, and opulent as you might think that it would be. I mean, obviously age has a little bit to do with that, or frankly a lot to do with that. So it's kind of toned down. You know, some of the Maybachs that you might have as young pups, you know, they are aggressive. But this one has kind of calmed down a little bit, and it's showing really, really nice. So the Maybach family history traces back. If you're familiar with it, or if the name sounds familiar, they do have family roots in the automobile industry. Wilhelm Maybach invented the internal combustion engine in the early 1900s. Son Carl Maybach developed the first high-speed diesel engine. And so needless to say, I mean, the Maybach family has always been synonymous with quality, no sacrifices, both on the automobile side, and certainly no sacrifices made in the vineyard. Interestingly enough, they were also, much like Heights, declassified the entire 2011 vintage, only relevant to this conversation that we're having today, because Maybach is not a cheap wine. You know, the price tag, I think we all know where the material kind of falls. It's a big decision. I mean, it's a big decision for anybody, but when you're talking about declassifying, you know, and not making a wine, they also make a second wine, the Amanus Cabernet out of Calistoga. But they declassified both of those in 2018. Didn't release a vintage. Speaks to the quality for sure. And again, made by Thomas Rivers Brown. Big deal. I think it's the Maybach has popped a couple 100-point scores, and speaks to just the overall quality of the wine. The 13, the 14, the 15. You know, 99s, 100s. I mean, it's just these are nice wines. These are 100% Cabernet. Which, and the Heights is actually 100% Cabernet. As we get into the rest of the wines tonight, these are the last of the two 100% Cabernets. It's a philosophical thing, you know, I think, as far as, you know, just obviously, number one, you know, how does that Cabernet grow based on where it's at? But number two, I mean, there's just a different approaches to, you know, the blend. You know, there's a reason that Bordeaux blends the way that they do. And obviously Dominus, not surprisingly, follow suit. Continuum, Della Valle. I mean, Realm is a blend of quite a bit, but both the Maybach Materium and the Heights, 100% Cabernet, and pretty darn good. Just a different line. So ultimately, I think, you know, I'll bounce it back to you guys. I think this is just a good example, and it kind of did exactly what I was hoping that it might, which was, I think we can all appreciate both wines. I think we'll all have preferences as to, you know, what we prefer over the other. I think we can both respect the fact that they're both well made. Maybach, like I said, at least to me, I don't perceive it to be quite as, you know, it's by no means overblown. I think it's a super, you know, it's a polished, beautiful wine. I think it's darn good. So I'll bounce it to you guys and see what you think.
It's by comparison to the Martha's, it's spicy. Mm-hmm. It's almost a little bit of exotic on the nose and on the palate. I think if our guests still have some in their glasses, I think it would be really interesting to keep these two and retaste them after we've tasted the younger wines, the next four wines, and come back and then taste the old wines again. Because traditionally, when you're doing a tasting, we do young to old. But tonight, three of us discussed this and decided we wanted to start with the more mature wines and then move forward. But I think it'll be a lot of fun if you still have some left in your glass to save these two, come back to them at the end of the tasting.
Yeah, no, agreed.
I really like this wine. As you said, this is a polished wine, and not in a bad way. It's not showing too much oak, but it's sleek. It's well delineated. I think that's a big aspect. And I think what helps that is, and I actually looked this up, was the Maybach Materium is notorious for having a relatively low pH, so pretty high acid. And I think a lot of people forget that, especially in Napa, where if you're chasing ripeness, you tend to destroy Cabernet's natural high acid. You know, Cabernet Sauvignon is a high acid grape, and if treated correctly, it's going to provide the freshness to the relatively large fruit that you need to make a balanced wine. This is pretty. It's really pretty.
Yeah. So do we have a poll to throw up on this one?
Yep, I'll launch it
Morgan?
now.
So we're going to ask you which of the two wines you preferred.
And while everyone's kind of voting, I'll go first. I think that, just being a big Napa, just a big Napa guy in general. I really like both. I will lean to the Marthas, but honestly, just by a nudge. I was stoked to try both of these wines. It's been a while since I've had the Marthas. Maibach, haven't had a ton. Haven't had any Materium with, frankly, this kind of age. Had some younger, far more assertive Materiums, but I love where these wines have gone, or this wine has gone, and it bodes well for certainly some of the big time vintages like 13, 14, 15, 16, where those wines can go. And so I will give, I'll give a nudge to the Marthas, but it's not by much. I really, really do enjoy both.
I would tend to agree with you entirely. For me, of the two, the Marthas is more to my palate. But having said that, I don't find that the Maybach anything other than absolutely delicious.
Yeah, I'm completely torn. I think the Maibach is honestly super sexy, and
yeah, exactly. That's a great description. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it's not it's extremely aromatically complex, and that's the thing. Is like I would, if I wanted to really think, I would maybe go with the Heights, but then when you go to the Maibach, you're like, oh, the aromatic complexity and the delineation of fruit it also makes me think. So I would actually say the Maibach. And it looks like, do you see the poll? It looks like Maibach is edging out Heights by one vote.
Is that right?
10 to 11.
I don't think we can see that, Silas, but that's all right.
Okay, yeah. So I don't, yeah. So it's, it's an even split nearly. One more is voted for Maibach.
That's great. Yeah, and again, obviously there's no right or wrong. It's just, it's great to,
Oh, there we go.
It's great
Can you
to
see that?
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say we can't see it because you don't want us to influence people. That's all right. Yeah, absolutely. It's give me a glass of either of these any night, and I'd be very happy. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So let's work our way into the Della Valle, which is one of my absolute favorite producers in Napa Valley. They have been for a while. A long time. Honestly, for as long as I've been into Napa Valley Cabernet, Della Valle has held, I've had a soft spot for Della Valle, and I think the wines are fantastic. So it was natural that I wanted to find a way to include one of their wines. This was the Collina Della Valle, and so working our way from, at least what they would consider to be their entry point into the family brand. This would be the Collina. They do make a Cabernet Sauvignon, or a Della Valle Vineyards Cabernet Sauvignon, and of course, obviously we'll get into talking about the Maya, which is one of the truly. We sometimes we toss around the word iconic loosely. It certainly is one of the most iconic wines in Napa Valley. It's one of the original cult wines. It's one of those wines that has been great for 30 years, and it's a special wine. So. Della Valle, founded in the early 1980s by Gustav and Naoko Della Valle, and they, as we saw on the map that Silas threw up before, not far from where the Maibach hails from, just up the hillsides in eastern Oakville there. And if you could, actually, while we've got it back there, as you can see, much like we were talking about on the east side with all of Heights' big neighbors. You look, you've got the Peter Michael Alperdi Vineyard. You've got, it doesn't say, it's just below Peter Michael, more towards the Silverado Trail. It doesn't say it there, but that's where, it doesn't say it there, but that's where the Joseph Phelps Bacchus Vineyard is. There's an upper and a lower Bacchus, and some great wines coming from Phelps Bacchus. And obviously, if you look across the street, you may notice quite a big boy, so Screaming Eagle, Also not there, but just north of Screaming Eagle would be the Tench Vineyard. Actually, there is a Tench. Okay, so that's where Bevan makes a terrific Tench Vineyard. Also, obviously, not obviously, it's obvious to me, but not to most people, the Harbison. So just to the east of Tench, more towards the trail is the Harbison. So that's where Bevan Harbison comes from. Across the street, Tierra Roja, fantastic wine also, or a fantastic vineyard that is primarily sourced, or actually had exclusively sourced by Tor Kenward. So really, really great vineyard there. But point being there is that the greater point is that we're talking about a prime spot of East Oakville. But as we work our way off the Silverado Trail and up into the hillsides, you start getting into those red, rocky, volcanic soils, and that is exactly what makes Della Valle, what it is. Super, super distinctive. The wines are always, very distinctively mineral-driven, beautifully perfumed, and the Kalina is no different. The 16 Kalina, I think, is a really, really nice wine. So, before I start talking about Della Valle, or at least talking about Della Valle a little bit more, certainly let's enjoy the wine. I think it's really pretty, really pretty. So the Kalina is sourced from it was important, to do it kind of side by side with the Realm, because whereas the Kalina is kind of the entry point into the Della Valle range, the Realm Bard that we'll have here in just a couple of minutes is, I wouldn't say the entry point into the Realm, but it's it's kind of an amalgamation of all the other single vineyards that are more of a blend. So Realm goes much higher. Della Valle, price wise, or what they perceive to be. My goodness, this is a really nice one, right? Silas and I were talking about this yesterday. This is this is the entry point into Della Valle. It's a beautiful, beautiful wine. This is what a lot of producers would aspire to make as their flagship or the top flight wine. But this is the again, the Kalina, which comes off of the younger vines on the hillsides, 100% estate grown fruit. So whereas sometimes when you see a wine that's labeled, you'll see a producer who makes a high-end wine, but they also make what they just call a Napa Valley Cabernet or Napa Valley, designate blend. In theory, they could be sourcing that wine from anywhere across the valley. And again, nothing wrong with that. But in Della Valle's case, the Kalina, everything that they make comes right off of the estate. They're not buying anything. They're not purchasing. They've owned the property for 40-ish years. And the Kalina is a beautiful entry point into their Cabernet, which is stunning, into their Maya, which is incredible. It's really, really good stuff. But the thing that makes Della Valle unique, both with the Kalina, also with the Cabernet Sauvignon, which is labeled as a Cabernet, but certainly has some other varietals in the blend. That's not a true Bordeaux blend per se by Napa standards. It's a Cabernet, but the Maya, which is most distinctive because of the heavy dose of Cabernet Franc. There is something about those red volcanic soils on the eastern side of Oakville, which are prime territory for Cabernet Franc. So whereas we're talking about, again, you saw, we don't need to put the map up, but this isn't all that far from. Not that far. It's a good frisbee throw from from where Maibach is sourcing their Cabernet from the whites. Maibach being 100% Cabernet, Della Valle not primarily, but their Cabernet is hit with a heavy dose of Cabernet Franc, which brings a beautiful savory quality to the wine. Really, really complex. There's a reason that a lot of those ripe bank Bordeaux wines have or blend the way they do. Della Valle, sometimes in blind tastings, the top vintages of Della Valle can resemble some top flight wines from San Emilion or Pomerol. But the, working our way, obviously we're tasting the Kalina here, but the Maya was introduced, the Della Valle Cabernet introduced in 1986, the Della Valle Maya in a couple years later, and the 92 Della Valle was awarded 100 points by Parker, and that sort of put Della Valle on the trajectory that they've enjoyed for the last 25, 35 years. still one of the most sought after wines, one of the original cult wines. And, for those, sometimes we hear that term tossed around. Oh, what is a cult wine? I mean, there's really no true definition, I mean, sometimes people think there's totally no right or wrong, but generally speaking, small production, critical acclaim, spared no expense of the winemaking, in the sense of Della Valle. I mean, they've had they've had some big winemakers. I mean, there's something to be said, obviously, for the land first and foremost that makes the wine, but the winemakers that Della Valle has had. Heidi Barrett, who made the early editions of Screaming Eagle, and I wouldn't say put Screaming Eagle on the map, but I mean Heidi Barrett is synonymous with Screaming Eagle. Mia Klein, Philippe Melka, and since 2017, Andy Erickson. So needless to say, there's been quite a few big names at Della Valle, and I think, in my estimation, I think Della Valle is Della Valle because of where they're at, but the fact that their assiduous attention to detail and some top flight winemaking, and it's not surprising that the wines have been fantastic for as long as they have been. Interestingly enough, it is the reason that, and getting into a slightly deeper dive into, why so many of those East Oakville wineries, especially up on the hillsides there, blend with a little bit of Cabernet Franc, where sometimes you'll see on the east side there, on the west side, closer to Heights over there, you'll see some more 100% Cabernets. The eastern side, if you think logically, from as far as the way the sun rises and the way the sun sets, the eastern side of Oakville, especially being up valley a little bit, it's very exposed. It's also exposed to, as the sun comes up, they get the early sun, and then as the sun works its way west, it's still getting that late sun as well. So the wines can typically get very, very ripe. So if it's not managed the right way, the wines can be, sometimes a little bit too flashy, sometimes a little bit too ripe, sometimes a little bit too opulent. That's where the wineries on the west side of Napa Valley that kind of nudge up to the Mayacanas there, again, your Heights, your Harlans, and everybody there, and again, painting with a super broad brush, because there's so many different ways, as Silas and Simon both know. I mean, there's so many different ways to mitigate that and manage that. But just in a nutshell, I mean, your East Oakville wines are going to be, or at least they're going to get a lot sun. They're going to get very, very ripe, and there's a reason that that Cabernet Franc, which can add a little bit of a different element to that Cabernet. That's exactly why you'll see a lot of these wineries over here incorporate as much or just kind of blend a little bit different. And I think that's what, to me, again, kind of bringing it full circle, that's where Della Valle is unique. And also the fact that Della Valle has never really pushed the limit. When you say cult wine, sometimes you think very, very hyper driven, super ripe wines, and sometimes that's the case. But with Della Valle, despite their acclaim, the wines have, again, very rarely pushed high 14s or 15% alcohol. Sometimes you can obviously get wines that are over 15%, sometimes 15.5%, and the alcohol can be imperceptible. But Della Valle, to me, is always in balance. It's always beautiful. It's always elegant. And if nothing else, I think, I'm glad that, we threw the Colina in here, because I think it shows the pedigree of what else is, in those barrels in Della Valle. Obviously, we're not trying the Cabernet, we're not trying the Maya, but it's a pretty darn good wine. There, I've primed you guys to tell you that it's a good wine, so you better agree with me. Okay.
I totally agree. I was really impressed by this wine. Obviously tasting through all the bottles when we were preparing the samples, and consistently impressed by, just for such a young wine, the aromatic complexity, the lushness of fruit, but also the really fine tannin, like really nice, just kind of mouth dusting tannin, and a pretty long finish. I mean, for an entry level wine, it's impressive.
Yeah, I really do. I agree.
Simon, I mean, to refer to this as an entry level wine is I mean, come on, guys.
Yeah, exactly, right. And kind of using it as a piggyback. As I was telling Silas and I were talking yesterday. I mean, it's all relative, because I think that we all know, the price tag of even the Colina. it's not an inexpensive wine. I mean, nothing that we're enjoying tonight is particularly inexpensive. Not that that makes the wine any better or worse, but even the Kalina, I mean, it's not an inexpensive wine, but as I discussed with Silas, it is Della Valle made a conscious decision to make this wine, again, not cheap, but the fact that they have the Maya. I mean, let's be honest, we'll throw a dollar amount. We'll throw $400 or $500, $600 on the Maya. We'll talk. That's the pedigree of the Maya. That's the pedigree of Della Valle that we're talking about. Their Cabernet is not cheap, but the fact that they do offer an entry point into the brand, that's a conscious decision. They felt that they could price this wine a little bit higher, but they felt that next generation, or that isn't familiar with the Della Valle that dates back to the 90s, would it be accessible if this was a time and a half or 2 times the price? Probably not. So
Yeah.
the fact that we can enjoy this wine, and again, not cheap, but I don't want to speak ill of anybody else, but let's say there's just not many other high-end Napa wineries that are making a wine at $500 that have an entry point like Kalina, where Della Valle, gives you a glimpse of what's to come.
I think if we did this blind and we didn't know it was a so-called entry wine,
100%.
it would stand out as being a superior wine in its own right.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay.
So let's get into the realm, and while I transition there, I'm peeking at the chat, and by all means, and I didn't mention this before, I'm sorry, but by all means, throw those questions into the chat. We'll try to integrate them and incorporate them into everything that we're doing tonight. But Jim, the 3 gentlemen that you see here, plus about 50-ish, and I think that's great. I mean, I think that we have a great turnout, and we were excited. We knew that this had a chance to really attract some serious people, people who really enjoy either maybe even familiar with the wines on an intimate level, but also being able to offer these 6 wines together as sit down for an hour and a half and enjoy these wines. It's a real treat. So, and Sue, we'll get to the continuum, but Continuum and Dominus, I'll just say it right now. We'll get there in a few minutes, but that could outlive those wines. Those 2 could outlive many of us, myself included. I mean, it's really that kind of wine for a lot of reasons, and we'll get there for those specific reasons. But just the winemaking and the pedigree, the higher elevation, especially where Continuum's at. I mean, that wine is tailor made for aging. So let's get into the realm, which is another one that I think a lot of us, based on the feedback that we had, and thank you everybody for those who offered some feedback as far as the wines that we were looking to enjoy. This one was exciting too. I mean, the fact that we were able to access it and get enough to share here, it's exciting. And I think that Realm does things a little bit differently than Della Valle, but there's just obviously different ways to go about making truly world-class wines. So founded in 2002 by Juan Mercado, and they were originally produced with the intention of showing different cross sections of Napa Valley, and their business model then and their business model now has always relied, for the most part, on strong relationships with people who own top flight vineyards. So in this case, the Farella family in Coombsville. So the Realm Farella has always been, one of their, flagship lines, along with, not surprisingly, Andy Beckstoffer. So Andy Beckstoffer has given Realm some great fruit from Tocolan and the Dr. Crane Vineyard in St. Helena. And it is, if you think obviously Schrader for Tocolan, but if you're talking about Dr. Crane, you're probably not seeing a better producer than Realm with that kind of fruit. So it's exciting to try this wine, which is the Bard. So this is literally a blend of pretty much everything Realm works with. And we did have a couple of people ask, but yeah, it does. This particular vintage, this is being the 18, does have a little Tocolan fruit. It's got a little bit of Dr. Crane fruit. It's got a lot of fruit and a lot of different grapes from across the vineyards that they work with. And it's just a good example of everything kind of working together. So again, whereas Della Valle, the Colina, or their lineup in general comes right off that estate there. Realm has always sourced fruit and made great single vineyard wines from that source fruit, or in this case, the Bard, the blend. But they also now have, they're super stoked and excited within recently. They now have their estate vineyards in Stags Leap District. So if anybody is familiar with the old Hartwell estate, that is now the Hartwell estate still exists, but a good chunk of that vineyard, the primary portion of that vineyard, is now owned by Realm. And so the Realm Moonracer is the estate vineyard, and it is coming off of what was once the old Hartwell estate there in Stags Leap District. So it's a good example of somebody who has always made great wines. Back in the day, the wines were made by Mike Herby since in the early days, and then they were great. But I think as Realm as we know it today, since 2011 is when Benoit Toquet took over the winemaking from Mike Herby. Scott Becker came aboard as the managing partner, and that's really allowed Realm to take what was already a solid brand. There were some bumps along the way. I mean, Realm's an interesting story in that people just assume that if you just buy the best fruit and make, hire a good winemaker, it's all going to run itself. And, winemaking, there's just a lot of variables that go into play. They've always had access to the great fruit. They've always had access to the Beckstoffer fruit. There's no doubt. But since 2011, at least in my estimation, the brand has been taken to a new level. The scores have been crazy. The wines have been great. The wines, I mean, some of the wines have been frankly compared to, just California versions of top flight Bordeaux. I mean, I know that some of the Dr. Cranes, some of the Realm Dr. Cranes have been compared to La Mission Aubryon, in terms of just like that style, obviously pumped up with, California muscle. But the fact that they're tossing around those types of comparison, I mean, those are really the kind of things you normally hear, like Spotswood. Spotswood's been around forever, and you hear Spotswood compared to, the California version of Chateau Margaux. Well, Spotswood's been around forever. Realm hasn't been around forever, but what they're doing with the Dr. Crane fruit, to have somebody like a Dunnick, a Jeb Dunnick, compare that fruit or compare that wine to Le Mission Aubryon, I mean, it's a big deal. So 2013 Bard was one of the best ever. This is considered to be in time. I mean, at least from a critical standpoint, this is why it was super, super exciting to get our hands on and try. This is supposed to be as good as it gets. I mean, this is so exciting. So, I mean, for those that haven't tried it, I mean, I'm going to try it here. I smelled it, before and worked my way through it. Yeah, I mean, so much the same way that the Materium was kind of like the yin and the yang to the Heights Marthas, both great wines, but just a little bit stylistically different. The Realm is a mouthful. I mean, the Realm is, the Realm is a rich, concentrated, dense, powerful wine. Drinking pretty darn well. I mean, we were talking about the fact that it's a 2018. Is it too young? The fact that hopefully everybody kind of gave the wine a little bit of air in the glass, or the fact that we're enjoying this with a little bit of air, it's certainly got some backbone, but it's showing a lot. This is a nice wine, and frankly, I mean, I think that if I were to, and I'll toss it back to you guys, I mean, this is a good example of it. Just kind of comes down to preference. I mean, the Kalina is just a little bit more reserved. The Realm is richer. The Realm is riper, without question. I mean, there's actually a little bit of Petit Verdot, or I'm sorry, goodness, what am I blanking out here? The Petit Syrah, sorry. There's some Petit Syrah even, which, a small little dash, but there's some Petit Syrah from the Beckstoffer Born Vineyard. So in this wine, so I mean, it really is this almost sounds like a pejorative, but I mean, it's a bit of a kitchen sink blend in that there's a lot of different varietals. There's a lot of vineyard sources, but when you're talking about the raw materials that Realm is working with, it's not surprising that the wine works. The wine is, it's got structure, it's rich. I mean, there's no doubt, let's be honest. I mean, of all the 4 wines that we've tried, to me, it's the youngest wine. So there's probably that element there too. But there's a lot of fruit, I mean, there's there's some dark fruit. There's some ripe, juicy fruit in here, and I'm interested to hear, what both of you guys think about the wine. I like it. I mean, I think it's just that kind of yin and yang to the Klima comes down to preference. I think it's a damn good wine, but I mean, there's no doubt that it's the ripest of the four for sure.
Yeah, the Bard has really got these mouth gripping tannins. I mean, it's which are fine if they are in balance with the rest of the fruit in the wine. I mean, it's you can't pick up a glass of young wine that is really tannic and say because it's tannic it's going to age well.
Yeah.
And you've got to have the balance. And with a young wine, and this is still young, the tannin is there, but behind it and around it is all of this luscious fruit and richness, which really makes this wine something which I would like to put down. For me, I don't want to drink it now.
Yeah.
I'd like to put it down for maybe 5 years, possibly even 10 years.
Yeah.
I put you on the spot, Jared, and I don't know if you know the answer to this question. What's the production of this? How many cases? Any
Good
idea?
question. So, and again, we kind of get into the whole, it's all relative because it is the highest production of all the realm wines. Not surprisingly, because again, it's a byproduct of a lot of their different vineyard sources. Call it about 1,800 or 2,000 cases. So, in the grand scheme of things, not that much, but that's only when it's kind of juxtaposed with their their single vineyards when you're talking about 500 cases, 400, 500, 600 cases.
Yeah.
But so in the grand scheme of things, not all that much. So this is their most produced blend, but again, all relative, not much. I think Jose hit the nail on the head in the chat. I mean, he's right. I mean, and Simon said too, and I think we can all agree. I mean, this is fun. This is what we kind of knew to a certain extent. I mean, I think that the realm is, you can see it. You can kind of see some personality poking out, but and Chris nailed it too. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's excellent in the style that it is. And that's what makes Napa is that there's just all kinds of different styles. Don't apologize for it. I mean, Heights doesn't apologize for the fact that they're just never going to make an overblown wine. They're going to consistently make that. Heights gives, they don't care if the wine is, low 90s, mid 90s, not rated at all, 100-point wine like the 2014. They don't care. Heights is Heights, realm is realm, their style is the style. But I think Chris kind of nailed it on the head. I mean, it is what it is. It's modern. They're not trying to be, sometimes you can kind of see when wines are manipulated to, and we all, three of us have kind of talked amongst ourselves in the office. We know when certain wines are manipulated almost to be a certain way. They think they need to be a certain way. Sometimes people think that, a certain wine is trying to mimic the Northern Rhone or trying to mimic Bordeaux. Realm is realm. Realm is Napa. You're never going to confuse this with Bordeaux, but you're not going to confuse this with, anything other than top flight, really, really nice Napa Valley wine for sure.
I think there are wines that try to achieve top scores, and there are wines that achieve the top scores because of what they are. And no, there's a difference. And you know it when you taste these wines that are really push and really forcing the effort of the winemaker and the extraction and the color and all the rest of it, because they think that's what the critic wants in order to get the top scores.
Yeah.
Winemaker that makes wine they want to make it will undoubtedly get top scores because the wine deserves to get top scores.
Yeah.
Do we have a poll on this one? First and second?
Yeah, let's launch the poll. And I totally agree. I think what tips me off to that, the lack of over extraction is the purity of fruit. It's not overwrought. It's not so concentrated that it's like, it's not that kind of liquor-like fruit that you get from wines that are been pushed beyond, I think, levels of sensible ripeness. And I agree with Simon. It's just like the tannin there is massive, but it's like it is enveloped by all this baby fat, as you would say. I would love to actually, compare this to a Maibach of the same year with a decade or more of age.
Yeah, totally.
They would be
Yeah.
at a similar point, honestly, where like they would have a more aromatic complexity, maybe a little bit of tertiary characteristics creeping in, but have that beautiful delineation and characteristic kind of purity to the fruit.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting while we're doing this poll that obviously we're comparing a wine from 2016 to a wine of 2018. So, I mean, there are differences just in the vintage alone. So I think for me, at least, when I can't answer the question because I'm one of the panelists, but I'm rating these two side by side tonight. And so, you know, which of these two is my favorite wine tonight? And that's the only thing that I'm using as my yardstick.
Yeah. Agreed. I think the Della Valle, I mean, it's incredible that it has that much balance at 26 as a 26.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a well-made wine.
Yeah.
And that's probably what they're going for. They're not trying to give you a wine that will, you know, take a decade to be approachable, and you have to respect that.
And I think that, you know, not to bury everybody in the details, but, you know, I think, you know, Della Valle, again, since 2007, I mean, they had a lot of great winemakers, but, you know, for the last 15-ish years, I mean, almost 15 years, you know, Annie Erickson has kind of honed himself into that vineyard, knows it well. And, you know, Annie Erickson makes some great wines. He's now working with the fruit at Mayacamas. And for those that, you know, were super freaked out about, oh, Mayacamas, I mean, Mayacamas, you know, obviously Bob Travers, no longer makes the wines there, and the wines are going to change so much. My estimation, I mean, they'll never be the Mayacamas of, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but Annie Erickson knows what he's doing. You know, Annie Erickson is a fantastic winemaker who, you know, it's such a cliche, but, you know, makes wines with what the land or what the fruit gives them. You know, if the wine is intended to be a little bit riper and flashier, that's the wine that he makes. If the wine is intended to be, I mean, with Mayacamas, I mean, I mean, you know, again, not to get buried down a rabbit hole, but he's going to make a wine that's true to Mayacamas. You know, if in the case of Della Valle, you know, he's going to make a wine that's true to Della Valle. And I think that, you know, the testament both to him as a winemaker and you know, just more from a broad perspective is kind of Della Valle in general. So, you know, how do those poll results look, Silas?
Della Valle.
Realm.
Yeah. No, but I think that we all agree. I don't think it's necessarily, it's by no means a qualitative assessment of realm. I think we just all, I mean, if the chat says as much, we've said as much. It's the reality of the wine is needing a little bit more time. You know, I mean, if we've got.
But going back to the point I just made, the 16 and 18, the 16 is going to be a little more approachable. It's bound to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
And so, and what Steve says, you know, that the realm is too young at this point. I don't think any of us would disagree with that.
Yeah.
But the fact that we are able to see the potential of this
exactly.
And that's, you know, that there is clearly potential for aging. And this wine will just get much better with some patience.
You know, and I think that is where, I mean, obviously for the three of us, but even for, you know, for those that are joining us today, I mean, that's something that we almost take for granted now because we're, you know, in the trade. But I think back to when I first started drinking wine, and then I kind of stepped in, you know, you have a bottle and you when you don't have enough reference points, when you don't have enough reference points, when you don't have, you know, a large enough sample size to pull from, you just evaluate the wine. There's nothing wrong with evaluating the wine in a true vacuum. But I think there's something to be said for as your palate evolves and as your winemaking or wine drinking, you know, experience sort of evolves and you're tasting more wines. That's when we can have these kind of conversations, not just the three of us, but obviously the you know, all of those that are joining us tonight that recognize, like, look, the realm is going to be a killer wine. The realm just, you know, needs time. Sometimes, to Simon's point before, there are some wines that just, it's harsh, it's tannic now, and I don't know if this wine's going to get better. There are those wines. But there's something to be said for kind of, you know, having that experience to get to a point where you can confidently say, I don't love this wine now, but I sure as hell love the fact that I got 6 bottles in the cellar, you know?
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So with that, let's move our way to Continuum. And it's another exciting one. I mean, as we get into, if we're talking about the press and we're talking about the scores, and on paper, this should be, the show-stopping flight. And I think that I'm stoked the fact that we had two flights and four really nice lines to kind of lead our way in here. But this is exciting because on paper, I mean, we're talking about big pedigree wines, wines that have big scores. I mean, you can't get any higher than 100 unless it's Suckling that's rating it. So, I mean, we're talking about, these are serious wines. So, the Continuum, initially conceived by Tim Mondavi.
He's on this feed, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I need to be careful. I know. No, but initially conceived by Tim Mondavi and his father, obviously the legendary Robert Mondavi. But this Continuum was, it is a new beginning for the Mondavi family, and it was a byproduct of the sale that the Mondavi family made to Constellation in the early 2000s. It was that was a big deal, for myself, and this is where I can only speak for myself. I didn't have the respect or the appreciation. I don't want to say the respect, the appreciation for how much of an impact the Mondavi family made to Napa Valley wine as it exists both today and certainly then. And trying some of those older Mondavi reserves and understanding the fact that that family, number one, has long been serious about winemaking, and and help elevate Napa to where it is today. There were some obvious bumps along the way. I think if it's an interesting read if you really do a much deeper dive into where kind of everything went astray, and obviously the production levels of as the Robert Mondavi winery existed in the late 90s and early 2000s. It kind of fell off the rails, and obviously you're talking about a legendary winery. For somebody who can obviously collaborate with the Rothschild family and make a wine like Opus One. There's a reason that collaboration was such a big deal. But the reality is, and Tim and the Mondavi family have said as much and will tell you as much. Just some decisions that were made in the late 90s and early 2000s that that sort of left them in a position to where they had to start over, and they eventually sold. And but I think Continuum is an extension of, and it's the next generation of the Mondavi family, really. It truly is their, I've got it here in my notes, but it's their legacy wine. It's their objective to create a singular wine that would not only compete with the best wines in Napa Valley, but carry the Mondavi family name into the next generation and compete with the best wines in the world. And I have been fortunate twice in the back in my past to get a chance to meet Tim Mondavi and hear him speak passionately. I think that's the most important thing. Speak passionately about where where Continuum came from and where Continuum is going. And I think that the biggest compliment that I can give Tim Mondavi and the Mondavi family and Continuum as a project, the highest compliment that I can pay them is that every time I hear him speak about it, again, when I had a chance to meet him or when I hear him speak in other settings, they're talking about the future. They're not talking about we were once this, we were not living off of our past reputation. We're talking about the future and carrying that Mondavi legacy into the future, which I think is a huge deal. So Continuum is an interesting project because it was, again, this is kind of like the jumping off point from the old Robert Mondavi winery. But the initial idea was to use fruit off of the valley floor and based on the relationships that the Mondavi family had with the iconic To Kalon vineyard, which they own the Mondavi portion, obviously the Opus One fruit. But when those relationships, because of obviously all the circumstances and everything that happened, when all that kind of dried up, that forced Tim to start in the Mondavi family. I speak Tim, but all of them. And at the time, Robert Mondavi was still still with us, but they had to start looking elsewhere. So it's interesting. The earliest vintages of Continuum, which I believe is, I should have it here, but it's certainly, 05, 06, 07. It's right around there. So, not too long after they had sold, the Robert Mondavi winery. But those early vintages were To Kalani vineyard fruit. Eventually, as I said, as those relationships kind of dried up a little bit and became more challenging for obvious reasons, then you started to see To Kalani fruit blended with a little bit of fruit elsewhere. And it's a great natural segue because Tim Mondavi has always been enamored with the Dalla Valle Maya and the wines that are coming off of the hillsides. And the Dalla Valle isn't necessarily 2,000 feet of elevation, but it's a hillside vineyard. And point being there is that there is something to be said for hillside vineyards producing the best fruit. Now, from a Burgundy perspective, you talk about what is, you talk about what, if you were to draw a parallel with Napa to Burgundy. Now, obviously there's great wines being made off the floor. There's great wines being made at super high elevation. There's great wines being made on the hillside. So kind of like in the middle there, there is something to be said for following sort of that Burgundian model, that the hillsides, stuff that's 750 to 1,000 feet in elevation is almost the best of both worlds. I mean, you're getting, you're getting a little bit of those hillside, soils, and you're getting some of that hillside elevation. You're in the sense of continuum, and a lot of these higher elevation vineyards, you're above the fog line, and you're above the fog that kind of comes in and creates a much different climate than elsewhere in Napa Valley, or at least elsewhere on the floor. So, Tim and the Mondavi family felt that they would take Continuum and eventually try to find a property that was hillside. And coincidentally, they were able to procure a property, an estate vineyard that is, in the grand scheme of things on the map, we have a map, but it wouldn't be relevant or wouldn't be able to show. But it's honestly not all that far from Dalla Valle. And again, just Tim's affinity for the Dalla Valle Maya. So Continuum does classify as what we call Pritchard Hill. Not a designated AVA because that's trademarked by the Chapelet family. But the Continuum project does call off of Pritchard Hill. So you are talking about some serious neighbors. I mean, you're talking about obviously Chapelet and Bryant and Colgan, and there is something to be said for serious wines coming off that little hillside there with that kind of exposition. And the biggest thing, and I will ask Silas to throw the Continuum vineyard map up if you could. The biggest thing as we get into these next two wines is we're not talking about 100% Cabernet by any stretch. We are talking about true Bordeaux blends. The Continuum vineyard or the Sage Mountain vineyard, which they've renamed, is barely 50% Cabernet Sauvignon. So this is a true Bordeaux blend. This has a lot of Cabernet Franc. I mean, obviously that varies, but the point being is not so much like just looking at it and you're kind of seeing the grid. You don't need to know the exact, what grapes are grown where, but the point being is number one, it's super strategic, but number two, you're seeing a lot of different colors. You're seeing a lot of Cab, a lot of Cab Franc, a lot of Petit Verdot, Merlot. I mean, you're seeing a lot of different stuff, and they've already identified, the blends, or I'm sorry, the varietals that grow best in these different blocks, but you're not seeing a lot of dark red, or you're seeing half dark red. And point being there is that, again, you're getting into a true Bordeaux blend. So,
yeah.
And I think that, as we try this, I'll talk a little bit more about the wine as we enjoy it. But I think, to me, I had all six wines lined up. To me, this was one of the most aromatically, pretty of all the wines. I thought the Dominus and the Continuum were the prettiest on the nose. Absolutely love this wine. I really do. I haven't had a chance to go too far back with the Continuum wines beyond pre-2012. 2012 was my first experience and introduction to Continuum. I had a chance to try the vintages, obviously young since then. But I just think they're killer wines. Silas, I know you had mentioned when you were putting the samples together that this wine was a monster. At least to me, and I can't speak for you. And actually, it's a good way to bounce it off to you. But I think that with a little bit of air, I mean, at least to my palate, this wine's pretty damn good. Obviously, it's going to be a 20, 30, 40-year wine. But I think with a little bit of love and care and a little bit of opening it up quite a while before, I think it's pretty darn good right now.
So mine has been sitting in my glass.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Silas.
Well, I was going to say I had the 15 recently, and similar. It has incredible aromatic complexity already, and layers of different types of fruit. It's so tight. I wouldn't say it. Maybe a monster is the wrong word for it, but it in that classic kind of young Bordeaux sense, it has. You can tell it has a lot to offer, but it hasn't unfolded yet. In that sense.
Yeah. Simon, what do you think?
Yeah, mine's now been sitting in my glass for close to 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And I tasted it when I first poured it, and I taste it again now, and it's just beginning to soften and open up and really show its true potential. It's so interesting. I hadn't seen this map of continuum before, but I mean, that is so typical of what you might see in a Bordeaux chateau.
Yeah.
The plots are like that. They're not, and this to me, up to this point, is not that I want it to be the most Bordeaux-like, because it's not intended to be the most Bordeaux-like,
right.
But given the other 4 wines prior to this, the other 4 were, to me, clearly somewhere in Napa.
Yeah.
This, if I was given this blind, I might be scratching my head more than once to decide where this is actually, whether it's a really great Bordeaux or a really great Napa cab.
And the fact that it's a 2016 too, it's not that it's evolved into a wine that has, Bordeaux-esque qualities. I mean, this is still a baby, and already out of the gate, it's showing that Bordeaux-like profile. I mean, I think it's impressive. And and I think,
stress.
What's that?
We should stress that they're not aiming to be Bordeaux. This
exactly.
Is clearly the old world influence on many wine growing regions around the world.
Yeah.
With Bordeaux has been to make a wine influenced by Bordeaux, but in our own image, not in the image of Bordeaux.
Absolutely.
There you have it.
And I think
there
that,
you have it.
Much the way I was talking earlier about, David Heitz, taking the baton from his father, and making literally 4 decades of vintages. I mean, Tim Mondavi, while he's, maybe not the day-to-day winemaker at Continuum, the fact that he's got 40, ish harvests under his belt. I mean, clearly he knows Napa Valley inside and out. He knows the floor. He knows the hillsides. He knows, and to Simon's point, so clearly Tim Mondavi is not he's not going to all of a sudden try to pivot and make anything other than a Napa Valley wine. But the fact that the quality of the wine, not to mention the blend, not to mention the the raw material combined with Continuum's, I mean, it's a beautiful. I mean, I apologize I didn't get a chance to pull some Continuum imagery, but I mean, it's a beautiful property. And I think it's easy for when COVID is past and we all get a chance to get out to Napa Valley. I mean, it's easy for us, understandably, to get everywhere that's on 29 or Silverado Trail because it's boom, 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 boom. I mean, it really is, it's just a who's who. But if you make the time to work your way up the mountains and up the hillsides, and you're not going to be able to see as many wineries in a day as you would be if you could just go, next door to next door to next door. That is, what I would tell those who are making the trip. I mean, it is worth it. I mean, not only just for the pictures that you can take, but I mean, it's just stunningly beautiful. Tastings are great. I mean, and the wines are phenomenal. And I think this is going to be I think it's gonna be a killer wine in
Yeah.
you know, the not too distant future. Not to mention another wine that, I mean, I would love to have this wine in the cellar. And you know, this is going to be fantastic. So let's get into number 6, and that is Dominus. So we're going, you know, we're going from heavyweight to heavyweight. I mean, we're going from Tyson to Holyfield. This is a big boy, and this is, you know, it's interesting. I had a chance to obviously get some feedback as to what everybody was looking forward to trying and what we thought would be wine of the night. I'm not going to prime anybody, but this was, I mean, Dominus was one of the responses in terms of just, you know, very, very much looking forward to try, both in terms of people who are very, very familiar with Dominus and have had many, many vintages, as well as those who have not had a chance to try Dominus before. And God, the wine smells fantastic.
Oh.
It's a good wine. It's a beautiful wine. So let's talk about Dominus. So the modern history of Dominus traces back to the early 1980s, but the true roots of Dominus's Napa Nook vineyard go further back. I mean, they go back many, many years. So, and they go back to the 1850s. And so the Napa Nook vineyard has been around, like I was saying before, the very, very beginning of the tasting. Napa Nook is one of the legendary vineyards in Napa Valley. So Christian Mouix came to the U.S. from France in his early 20s, studied enology and viticulture at UC Davis, and he was very intrigued, despite not obviously, here I say obviously again, but you know, his family has so much history in Bordeaux, but he was nonetheless very, very intrigued about, you know, the idea of what the potential that California and specifically Napa Valley held. So he was, coincidentally enough, introduced by Robert Mondavi to the daughters of Napa pioneer John Daniel. And John Daniel was the original owner of Napa Nook Vineyard in Yountville. And John Daniel's daughter, one of the daughters, the most notable daughter, is Robin Lale. So Robin Lale is the daughter of John Daniel. And so as we talk about the Lale Vineyard, J. Daniel Cuvée, another top flight Napa Valley Cabernet. So Robin Lale has a lot of history in Napa Valley. She inherited the vineyard from her father, and along with her sister. And again, she's a proprietor now of Lale Vineyard. So taking one of Napa's truly great vineyards, and then in Christian Mouix's case, applying Bordeaux techniques to the farming, he's established a benchmark for what is, you know, certainly one of the model. And again, we talked before, we said it throughout. I mean, again, not that Napa Valley in by any way is trying to mimic Bordeaux, but if you were to, at least in my estimation, I mean, if you were to say, hey, what is the one wine year in and year out that is most distinctly Bordeaux-like? That, hey, I want to have a Napa Valley wine that is, you know, has some leanings to Bordeaux. There's plenty of wines that I think are great, that are more subdued, that are more elegant, that are more restrained Napa, but I can't think, at least I can't think of a wine that would trump Dominus in terms of a wine that combines the best of both worlds, and certainly has those Bordeaux leanings. And not surprisingly, because it's you know, there's so much Bordeaux philosophy. And Silas, if you could throw up the Dominus Napa Nook Vineyard map, and the point, you know, or the idea of throwing this up is, you know, ostensibly it's not particularly in depth, or there's not much for me to talk about. But when you see it here, it is, let's see here. Yeah, I chopped it off here. So, well, if nothing else, I mean, you can kind of see that, number one, there is a highly, highly strategic approach to, everybody thinks that, well, a vineyard is a vineyard, and we're just going to plant these vineyard and plant these rows. I mean, clearly, I mean, there's 23E, 7B, 7A. I mean, this is, in modern winemaking parlance, I mean, this is very, very sophisticated. Dominus has really zeroed in on everything But Silas, if you could talk, because you probably know it a little bit better than I do, but Dominus especially takes a lot of Bordeaux making or Bordeaux philosophies and incorporates them into Napa Valley, specifically stuff like if you could talk just a little bit very quickly about like something like green harvesting or crop thinning or stuff that that is very again, not that it's necessarily not done in Napa, but some stuff that is far more prevalent or important or has stood the test of time in Bordeaux. So I'll kind of pass it back to you to quickly talk about those winemaking ideals that make Dominus Dominus.
Yeah, that was actually one of my first tasks was writing a big Dominus piece for one of our business partners. And the thing about Dominus, it was such a storied terroir. But when Christian Moix came in, he actually ripped up and started a large scale replanting that lasted into the early 90s. And it really took him that long also to understand the winemaking style that was required for the site. And what he really changed was, he wasn't hampered by, I've worked in viticulture up in Oregon, and you kind of, if you grow up and you constantly work around your neighbors only, you tend to, you rely on them for support when you're choosing new rootstock or new clones. That is the actual plant material and what kind of genetics it has. And you're relying on a nursery that your neighbor suggests, for instance. And especially when these people from Bordeaux or Burgundy come into our region, the western regions of the United States, they tend to bring less of a hampering in that style. So he chose lots of different clones, lots of different rootstocks that were a little bit more tuned towards the drainability of each soil type, how it retained water specifically. He also changed row orientation a little bit so that it wasn't, the hot, afternoon sun wasn't beating down on so much of the fruit. You change how much fruit you're actually leaving on the plant. And that's what you said, green harvesting. That is like going through before veraison, before color change in the berry, and actually dropping a lot of the fruit. And so that the plant is then just focusing its energy on less clusters. And you tend to achieve, physiological and aromatic ripeness of the skins before the alcohol content gets really large. And that's, back in the 90s, that was huge. That was going against the grain.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so true.
He's always made a very balanced wine because of that. And he also he also planted all the other, noble grapes of Bordeaux. So, really forward thinking, really important changes to the valley for sure.
Yeah. Simon, what do you think?
Well, I've been lucky enough to have a number of vintages of Dominus and actually was at a Dominus tasting with Christian Moix some years ago now. And I mean, his passion for the wine and the wines that he making is the wrong word. He allows them to become what they are through his guidance. I mean, it's not you don't go into the lab and mix the test tubes and the Bunsen burner. And as Silas was saying, I mean, he came in and he looked at this land and he realized the potential for the land and then said, okay, let's approach it from my point of view and not from, no matter how good my neighbors may be, from my point of view and how I would like to see my wines progress. And I remember the first few vintages of Dominus were not that well received. There was here is Christian Moix, the crown prince of Pomerol, who was coming into into Napa, and his wines were not that well received to begin with. And at the time he said to me, be patient not with the wine, be patient with the vines. And as they mature, as they get older, the fruit will become much more complex, much more interesting. And I think there's no question that in the last probably 15 years more, maybe even 20 years, Dominus has now become a standalone wine in the Napa with a quality that is something that is on its own, but in the pantheon of some of the great wines of the Napa.
I mean, that is an absolutely perfect segue for me to get into what I had, like just like little bullet points that I think are just like pop off the page. We'll take some questions and wrap this up. But to your point, Simon, the Dominus wines have always been distinctive, unique. I mean, 91 and 94 are two of the truly legendary wines in
94.
Napa Valley. But 9 of the last 10 vintages, and again, not the press matters, but let's just call it what it is. 9 of the last 10 vintages of Dominus, 97 points or higher, multiple 100-point wines. Clearly, we're all enjoying this wine, and we're talking about a wine that's showing pretty damn well tonight. But I mean, if I had another one, if I had this in my cellar, I would be. I mean, I'm fortunate to have a couple, but I mean, if I had a case or 2 of this in my cellar, ecstatic. You're talking about, not to toss around, a word that sounds just like, blasphemous, but I mean, a true Napa first growth. I mean, you're talking about a Napa first growth vineyard. I mean, a vineyard that has been, proven for, many, many decades, but also is obviously in the hands of the right caretaker now. 40-year track record of being one of the Napa Valley's most cellarable wines.
Yeah.
It doesn't get much better.
Yeah.
So I think that, with that, I mean, again, I know this tasting has gone, much longer than our other ones, but by all means, if anybody does have any questions and wants to ask anything, we can take a couple and wrap it up. I know somebody earlier on was asking as far as availability of everything, and specifically there, Jose, but I know there was a question earlier just about general availability. So I'll be honest, I think that the Maibach was the most challenging. So the Maibach is what caused the entire tasting to be a little bit, like we had to kind of keep this to the smallish group that we did. I mean, relatively speaking, great turnout, but that's a challenging one. I don't know, Jose, if we've got any 9 left. We'll certainly take a peek, but that was a tough one.
Yeah, I don't think so.
We are blessed. Yeah, there you go. Blessed that everything else, for the most part, in different formats, or at least in some capacity, this is great to be able to taste these wines and have a chance to, not in large quantities, not enough for a massive offer to to our clients that are outside of the tasting tonight, but everybody that is enjoying these wines tonight, if there is something that of interest, as long as we're not talking about the Maibach, we have access. We have other vintages of Maibach, which are killer wines. The 9 is going to be tough, but everything else that we're enjoying tonight is all on the table. So yeah, I mean, if any other questions pop through, we'll answer them. But if by all means, Silas, throw up wrap it up with the wine of the night poll. If you could,
we didn't rank these last 2, but.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Well, I already launched.
That's all right. Too late. So I would just make one point about somebody asking if these wines are available to sell. Some of them may be, as Gerard has just mentioned, but the purpose of these tastings is not necessarily for us to be here to push wines and to sell these wines to you.
Correct. Absolutely.
It is for us to share our passion and our enjoyment of really great wines with you, to perhaps introduce you to some that you may not have had before, perhaps to share some with you that you have had before, but to share our interest and our passion in these wines. And if there happen to be some that are available for sale, that's almost a secondary.
Yeah.
Agreed. And to that point, we have some tastings coming up that I'm really excited about. I can't wait for some of our Italian tastings, more of our French tastings, and of course, to spread the love and wrap our domestic partners.
Did any of you go back to the 209s at the beginning?
You know what?
I drank mine.
I just have. That Maybach is singing.
Yeah. So I will, Silas, assuming that you've got a decent. There you go. So
You see it? Yeah. So yeah, I have to agree. I think the minute I opened up all the, many of these
Yeah.
bottles, I prepped the samples, by myself, and the all the wines were showing really well. I was impressed from the get go. But when I opened the Dominus, I like took a second. It's just, it smelled so good right out of the gate, and I was like, wow, this is a special wine.
So I have two comments on the poll results that we're looking at. Number one, whomever the two people are that voted 2016 Continuum, I raised a glass to you because I will be number 3. And also, and that's not obviously to say, I mean, that I just think the Continuum is killer. I love it. I love it. So even though it didn't win, I think this is where we all talk about when we clearly have a group that enjoys good wine and appreciates a lot of different styles. But it's funny, like in the past, going back 10 years, maybe I would have been, I would have looked at this and thought maybe there was something like, man, maybe I'm missing something. No, like I love the Dominus. I love the Maibach. I don't care that only 2 other people in this group voted Continuum. I'm number 3, so I'm waving the flag for the Madonna because I think that the Continuum is fantastic, and I'm trusting my own palate here. And then I also think it's fascinating that the Realm got 0 votes, but I don't think any of us, any of the 50 people that have joined us tonight, and the 3 of us, I think we would all love to have a bottle of Realm in 5 years from now. The fact that there's 0 votes for it as wine of the night, doesn't mean anything qualitatively. I think we just all recognize that, what? It's still a young pup. It's still a baby. It just needs a little bit of time. So, yeah.
Gerard, if you opened a bottle of Realm for me, I wouldn't complain.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I agree. And, to Jose was asking about the 16 compared to the 13. 2 similar vintages. I mean, I think 16 and 13 are going to be your 2 monster. I mean, you're talking about, we're living through an era, a modern decade. I mean, from 12 through 18 in Napa Valley, 19 are supposed to be, when they do come, they're supposed to be terrific. I mean, 12 through 18 especially, killer vintages. 13 and 16, probably the blue chips. I mean, 13s, God, I had a chance to try. It's funny. I had a chance to try the 13 Dominus young. Like, I mean, they must have just slapped the label on it and put it out. And, I had a chance in a restaurant setting to try a little bit that somebody had poured for me. And even at that time, you're talking about this is just after the 13 was released. Phenomenal. So as good as the 16 is, I mean, if you've got 13 in the cellar, I mean, and you've got that beautiful special label, anniversary label with Christian's picture on it, makes it a little bit more distinctive. But in all seriousness, I mean, the 13 is absolutely killer. So I mean, as much as we're enjoying the 16, I mean, this speaks to just the pedigree of Dominus. I mean, we're talking about 13 and 16, but my God, 8, 9, 10. 11 is a great Dominus because it's more of a Bordeaux style, Napa Valley vintage, cooler climate. So Dominus knows what they're doing, how to handle those kinds of vintages. I mean, yeah, it's killer. So I think these are just great. I mean, honestly, the feedback is fantastic. I'm glad to see, honestly, the really positive feedback on the Maibach. Not positive feedback, but just I'm glad to see the Maibach show as well as it did. On paper, you look at that line and you're thinking it's going to be so stylistically different than the Marthas. And the reality is, with a little bit of age, that gap narrows a little bit, and the Maibach becomes a little bit more of a beautiful wine. And I think it was great. So, yeah, I mean, for those that joined, it was an absolute pleasure. I mean, I'll turn it over to you guys to just kind of wrap it up, throw some last thoughts in, put a bow on it. But this was fantastic.
Well, I would like to just thank all of you for joining us because it's without you we wouldn't be here doing this, and I must say that I really love doing this. So thank you.
Yeah, I totally echo that. I love tasting wine with people, and that's probably what I miss most, during the pandemic, is sharing wine with people and discussing it. And it's an art form, and we all appreciate it. And it's nice to appreciate it together. So please, keep an eye out for future tastings, and hope you can join us.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of wrap it up from my side, I mean, as the two guys said, thank you very, very much. We don't take it for granted. This is fun. I mean, technology is great. It brings us all together. I mean, we're all in totally different spots, but this was a truly, truly enjoyable evening. We'll be in touch as far as, with what might be available within these 6 wines. We'll also be in touch with a link to the tasting. Most importantly, obviously, about future tastings. So this was a true pleasure. So thank you for everybody that joined. I'm glad. Thank you to the 6 wines for showing as beautifully as they did. And with that, I will say cheers on my side, and thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Cheers.